This is Tell Your Story Alaska. We talk aviation, history, theology, but most of all, the raw stories of Alaskans and the gospel. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Tell Your Story Alaska. I'm very excited about today's episode because we are going to be talking about history, one of my favorite topics, and I have a professional historian today. I don't know if he'll want me to call him that, but I'm calling him that. I've got my friend Pastor Adam London, who lives in Bethel. He pastors a church called Bethel Evangelical Covenant Church. He also teaches classes at Alaska Christian College in Soldotna. He's been in Alaska since 2001 and in vocational ministry in Alaska since 2004. And Adam, if I'm not mistaken, you have lived in several villages and you've kind of bounced around a little bit. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I have bounced around a little bit, but yeah, mostly out in Western Alaska.
Yeah, okay. Cool. And so how long have you been the pastor at the Bethel Evangelical Covenant Church?
So this is our 6th year, and we previously had just been serving in Unalakleet before this.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I had some friends that were in Unalakleet also. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the history of the church in Alaska. This is something I've been interested in for some time, and I was doing some of my own studying, and then I bumped into you at a conference and realized you actually teach a class on this at Alaska Christian College. And so I just asked you if you would come on, and instead of me having to do all the studying, you've already done it. And so I asked if you'd record, and you said yes. And so I'm going to be learning right along with the audience, whoever's listening, about the history of the church in Alaska. And today we are going to talk about the Russian Orthodox Church, which was the first church to come to Alaska, and the Catholic Church. And now, because it's history, I did have to look up a couple of quotes. One is a common quote used when it comes to history, and it's those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And you've probably heard that quote before, and this is very true in the missionary world, which is why I think this is such an important topic to learn about the history of the church in Alaska for all the goods and the bads from which we can learn. And then another quote I read was, we learn from history that we learn nothing from history. And so we want to avoid that becoming part of what that quote is saying. And so I think for the next 5, maybe 6 episodes with Adam, we're going to be talking about the history of the church in Alaska and hopefully learn a thing or two and gain some wisdom for the missionary community in Alaska. So Adam, why don't you go ahead and start us off with the Russian Orthodox Church? I will let you just take it away, and we're here to learn from you.
Sounds great. Well, thanks, Billy. I love Alaska church history, and that's a hobby of mine. When I was in college and also in seminary, pretty much anytime we had some sort of open project, I would always tie it to Alaska church history. And so that's kind of where I started going down this road. And I used to think, oh, well, there's probably not a lot of written stuff down about Alaska church history, so it's going to be a lot of really digging. But there's so much out there. And so it's really just a matter of compiling it and getting it all in one place. But certainly one of the things that we need to keep in mind whenever we look at history, Alaska church history, is that history is in the eye of the beholder. Whoever's telling the history has a bias, always has some bent, and that's just inevitable. I have that as well. We all have that. Whenever we tell a story, we either want to be the hero or somebody's the villain. And certainly the story of Alaska church history has been told a lot, especially by secular folks, and often the church becomes the villain. And there's no doubt that the Alaska Native people have faced severe trauma, cultural trauma, lots of abuses. It's easy to just pin it on one type of people, like pinning it to the church. But I don't think that's actually fair. I mean, when we think about the church today, is the church all the same all across denominations across the world? Certainly not. Certainly not. And so, I mean, likewise, back then, I mean, maybe even more so than today, the churches were very different because you had churches coming from different countries. There was no internet. They were very, very different people. And so you can't just say that all of the church caused cultural trauma and that all of the church was evil, or you can't even say that all of the church was good for that matter. And so hopefully we can learn some of the mistakes as you brought up, but also that we can learn about some of the things that God did that he maybe is continuing to do and how we can join him in that. That's usually where I start. When I talk about Alaska church history, I start with
that's a really good point, Adam. So I think there's a slight lag, so we're going to talk over each other a bit, but that's a really good point. I have heard very simplified versions of church history, and it's usually on the negative. And so it's acknowledging that there are all these negative things that we can learn from. But of course, as we know, people and history is more nuanced, like any story is. And so it's valuable to dive into it. So, yeah, great points.
Yeah. And also there's huge differences between what did the church do? What did the government do? What did individual for-profit companies do, which will be very important for the Russian Orthodox because there's all three of those at play. Private, church, and government are all at play in their history. But you know, God has been at work since the very beginning, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and we're not as Christians, we don't believe that God just sat back and now is just watching this world spin. He's active in this world. He's active in our lives. He's been active throughout church history. And I love looking at missiology and, you know, how did missionaries go into tribal groups and what was God already doing? And Alaska is no different. Alaska Native people had God already working well before any missionaries showed up. And you know, the Bible tells us the heavens declare the glory of God and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. And what greater place than Alaska to just look up and see that there is a creator, there is a God. And so almost all Native peoples here in Alaska had some sort of idea of who a Guyun was. That's what they call God here in this area, down also, I guess, in the Aleut area as well, a Guyun, and different names for who the creator was. And so there was always this idea that in most tribal areas that there is some sort of creator, and it manifests in different ways, the way that they try to worship the creator. And you know, just like us, we also struggle with worshiping creation rather than the creator. I mean, the Bible even talks about that. Paul talks about that. And so the Native people, when that got mixed up, that turned to shamanism. And so that's very common in Western Alaska. That was kind of the traditional religion, was based around shamanism, animism. And along with that, though, there was a real sensitivity to the spirit world. And there still is. When you go into the villages today, there's a real sensitivity to the spirit world. And so shamans were very important people. And so there's lots of different stories, but probably the best recorded one is the story of Manila. And out in Kotzebue, the hospital system is Manila, and it's named after this shaman who some people wouldn't call him a shaman because he did not believe in what the secular shamans, the non-Christian shamans were purveying, but in reality, he was a spiritual man, and so he got a vision that, or heard a vision, heard something about how he was supposed to worship only the Father and Son Spirit. And only the Father and Son Spirit. Wow, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That's like that should ring a bell for those of us who are believers in Jesus. And so he kind of stopped worshiping all of the animals, the other spirits, other shamans, and he started going around, and he felt like God was telling him, or that he felt like the Father and Son Spirit was telling him to go around and tell others to stop worshiping false gods and get ready for these people that were going to come and share about the Father and Son Spirit. And there's lots of stories like that in lots of tribal groups, how God was preparing the way. And so there's a couple of books on Maniluk. There's a YouTube video that you can watch that's like 45 minutes long. But really cool stuff. God was working even before the first missionaries really dug in and really started sharing the gospel in Alaska. And so that's
Adam, if you don't mind, I just want to pipe in on that, because the thing you're talking about right now has interested me so much, because I saw similar things when I worked with a tribal group of people in Mexico and now here in Alaska. These connections, a belief in a creator. It's almost like the natural countenance of man is to believe in divinity. Our natural countenance is not, atheism or lack of a spiritual realm, if you will. And I do have a book on Maniluk. It's by Sarah Hale. I don't know if I pronounced it right.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Okay, good, because that's the one I'm reading, and I've been wondering about the legitimacy of Maniluk as a historical figure, and was he really this way, or is it something that's become more legendary? And anyway, it's interesting you bring it up, and I feel like you and I could do an entire episode just on sort of the culture of Native Americans before the arrival of outsiders. So that would be an interesting topic.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, we got to get through these ones first. But
I know I'm jumping the gun here.
But it is really interesting. So, like I said, Maniluk is probably the best recorded one. And I would say there is a lot of historical evidence around the things that he did. And so, in fact, if you go to the University of Alaska archives, they have audio recordings of elders who had personal experience with Maniluk. And so these are old audio recordings, and so they're reflecting from like 150 years ago, something like that. But there's a lot of historical evidence for Maniluk, and that he did what he said he would, and that he had these prophecies. These are not things that we've kind of made up in modern times. Like prophecies like people are going to fly through the air, people are going to be on boats that will go the speed of caribou, and that people are going to come those and share. Yeah, pretty interesting stuff. But
some of his prophecies were
God
just
can
incredible.
Do that. Yeah, but all of it with the point that people are going to come and share about this Father and Son Spirit. That's what all of the prophecies were leading towards, that this is God revealing himself. And so I love that. These weren't just some fantastical, magical things. But anyway, so God was working within the Alaska Native people well before any missionaries showed up. And I think it's really important to note that, there's this idea that Christianity is this white gospel, this white religion. And I've heard that a number of times. I'm sure you've heard it too. But that's just a false thing. And God is so much bigger. And he is working in the Alaska Native tribes. And hey, Jesus himself was a tribal person. The nation of Israel is a tribal group, my friends.
That's interesting.
So any idea? Yeah, the 12 tribes of Israel, like, it doesn't get more tribal than that. So the idea that this is a white
really
man
good
religion,
point.
that's something that we have to break through. Certainly there were a lot of white people that brought Christianity, especially to Alaska, but it's not all white people either, as we'll see throughout these 5 episodes. There's a lot of Native people and non European people that brought the gospel to Alaska. And so God is good. And so even as we think of that, we have to look at the church history and realize it was people. We are a broken people today. They were a broken people back then. We are all sinners in need of a savior. And so there's some goods, there's some bads. And certainly we see that, especially I feel like the bigger churches like Russian Orthodox and Roman Catholic, because they're such big agencies, as it were, it's easier to see some of their flaws. And so there's been a lot of criticism against the Russian Orthodox Church, a lot of criticism against the Roman Catholic Church. And, some of it is legitimate. There's no doubt. Starting off with the Russian Orthodox Church, and sometimes people will point out that there were slaves taken by Russian Orthodox priests. There was abuses that happened at the hands of the Russian Orthodox Church. That's definitely that happened. And then even within Christianity, there's criticism that the Russian Orthodox Church they had a form of syncretism rather than coming in and explaining how some of the taboos or the relics were not honoring God, the Creator. They instead replaced them and imposed new taboos and just replaced the old relics with the relics of icons of the Russian Orthodox Church. And you can still even see that today in some villages where you'll go in and people will be like, oh, this is my icon and this is what keeps the evil away. I'm like, nope, that doesn't do that. And certainly the Russian Orthodox Church, I think, fairly has a criticism that they don't play well with others. And that's true for a lot of our denominations. But I think that especially the Russian Orthodox is probably one of the most standoffish against other denominations. And anyways, that's all rooted in other church history stuff, so we don't need to go into that. But so there are some legitimate criticisms, but there's also a lot of really good things that they brought. And I believe that Jesus came with the Russian Orthodox Church, and there are many people who we're going to see in heaven because of that. At least that's my own theological bent. But regardless, so the Russian Orthodox Church gets also really bad rap for bringing in alcohol. I'd say that's probably like one of the worst things that they get a bad rap for. And that's not entirely accurate because the Russian Orthodox Church is tied to the government because it's, even today, when you look at the Ukraine-Russia war, the Russian Orthodox Patriarch, their Pope, as it were, he has made it very clear that he thinks that Russia is on the side of God, and that they are fighting a holy war by trying to go in and reclaiming Ukraine and killing the Nazis, as it were. And so there's a very close relationship between the church and the government, even in Russia today. And back then it was even stronger. And so it's hard to look at it and say, oh, well, the Russians came in and did all this and not blame the church, because they were hand in hand, at least on paper. But you and I know that when we encounter people in the church, even in our own churches, not everybody in our own churches are even Christian. They don't all have a true relationship with Jesus Christ yet. And so clearly not all Russians were Christian. And you can see that in kind of three really distinct groups. There were the explorers, the traders, and then the actual church evangelizers, the priests, the missionaries. And so I kind of break those three up into three areas of exploration, exploitation, and evangelism. And so some of these things were happening simultaneously, but there was actually pretty distinct periods of time throughout the Russian Orthodox Church history, starting with exploration. And so that kind of makes their church a little bit more unique, because Alaska was this undiscovered land, as people like to say. Obviously, the native people were here already, but So it was back in 1648 that some people will claim was the first time that a Russian explorer reached or saw any Alaska land. And so 1648, Simeon Desnev was the first one to sail through the Bering Straits and record seeing another land, at least according to some historians. There's some discrepancies on who was actually the first, but anyways,
yeah, Adam, I actually I have
1600s.
an episode that's called The History of Discovery of Alaska. It's one of the maybe the third or
Nice.
fourth episode. I did that research. I know that date and those names, so it's in there. Yeah, that's really
All right, good. So
I love that. I love that kind of history. So thank you for bringing it out. That's good.
good. So we won't hammer on that one very much, but
Okay.
exploration. So exploration in the early 1600s, 1700s, Russians were starting to come over. Check out podcast number 3 or so. And most people think of Vitus Bering as kind of like the big explorer that came to Alaska. That's why we have the Bering Straits. That's why it's named that, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And with those explorers, because the Russian Orthodox Church is tied to the government, undoubtedly there had to have been some Christians that came on those boats, right? And so that really was the first era, and there's records even of like in 1791 that a Russian boat chaplain was on one of these exploration visits, and he did a census of some Aleut islands, and it's reported that he baptized a large number of native people, which is interesting. And that is a common thing that happened in the Russian Orthodox Church, which is part of what causes the waters to be so muddied, because in the Russian Orthodox Church, once you were baptized, you were a full citizen of Russia. And so those Aleuts were considered full citizens of Russia as soon as they had been baptized. And so that causes some real colonization kind of issues there. And so also,
do you think there was do you think there was a political motivation there to baptize them for that reason, to assimilate them or make them a part of the Russian culture?
Absolutely. I would say that's not across the board. Like, was this boat chaplain's goal of trying to make them Russian citizens? I don't think so. That's my own just personal feeling with that one. However, definitely later on, that did become a strategy for sure. And the Russian government made it clear that the church was to baptize to make Russian citizens. And so I don't think that was the original ones. And I don't think that was, say, like the monks who came. I don't think that was their motivation at all. But I do think that the government had that motivation at one point. And so again, that muddies the waters, because what was their real motivation? Were they trying to share the gospel? Were they trying to Russianize? There's a mix in there, and it's really hard to tell whose motivation was whose with a lot of these people. And definitely with the explorers, I'd say they were generally pretty genuine. I'd say that they didn't really care that much about expanding the Russian Empire. It wasn't until later on. And so I think that there was a period of exploration which led into a period of exploitation. And so did the Russian presence in Alaska cause exploitation and some cultural trauma? Undoubtedly, yes. And I don't know how much of you hit that in your podcast, but there was fur traders, there was hunters, whalers that all came over, and they literally wanted to come and exploit. I mean, there's kind of no way around that. They came to take things from the land, from the sea, from the people, and they came to benefit. That's the whole point of why they came. And so it was almost never a fair trade. They would come
then in
and
some cases
take pretty
but not
big riches
all,
of furs, and they would often
the
trade alcohol and tobacco.
Sorry, I think we stepped on each
Sorry,
other a
what was
little
that?
bit. You cut out for a second, but I think in some cases, the Russian Orthodox Church was used as a tool for their exploitation. And of course, that's bad, but of course, that wasn't always the case either. It was a mix match.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, I would say that the period of exploitation that followed the period of exploration really wasn't even a part of the church at all.
Huh.
And I think that's an important thing to kind of try to differentiate if you can. It's difficult because the Russian Orthodox Church was the state church and all of the people were kind of technically Russian Orthodox people. But this was not a church thing. This was not even a government thing for that matter. The period of exploitation really was personal people looking to benefit personally. And so while there were undoubtedly some Christians in this, this was mostly individuals wanting to go and get rich. And
Yeah.
so that makes a big difference too. So yeah, I don't know if
This sounds similar to me too. I love early American history. You know, Columbus, Cortez, Pizarro, all of these guys came with most of them were Catholic, but they or Anglican, something like that. But they came, you know, to spread the gospel of Jesus. But then they just seemed to be obsessed with gold. And so it's almost like the native conversion was just a useful thing rather than a genuine thing. And that, of course, is the religious abuse that we all despise.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that really came into play in this area. I mean, so the period of time was basically from like 1750 until like early 1800s. And so it wasn't a large, I mean, well, I guess that is a pretty significant amount of time, but this wasn't like hundreds of years. This was some 50, 60 years where really the private companies and private individuals were coming into Alaska. And in fact, there was a number of these individuals who kind of bonded together because the government, who knows for sure what all of the government motivation was, but they're seeing all of these individuals making money and like, well, we need some of that money, right? And so they tried to like impose restrictions and whatnot on them, and so they formed this company, a band of Russian traders that became the Russian American Company. And the Russian American Company actually eventually became when Russia sold Alaska to America, became the Alaska Commercial Company, which we still have today in a lot of villages. And so that the Alaska Commercial Company started way back in 1797 with the Russian American Company. But the Russian American Company, they saw eventually, it took them a while, but it took them a while, and they figured out that if there was a church in a village, the native people were more docile. They weren't as aggressive or antagonistic towards the Russians, and so they had this idea that, oh well, we should get our own priests and start paying for our own priests. And so it was actually the Russian American Company that paid the largest for priests to come to Alaska and have churches. And so they were paying as much as 1,200 rubles a year back in 1817, which, I'm not a big economist, but just Googling, that was a fair amount of money. Whereas the monks at the time, the ones that were officially sent by the church, not the ones that were hired by the Russian American Company, they were only making 200 rubles a year. So 1,200 versus 200. And so the Russian American Company saw that this was a profitable thing to have churches, which is interesting. So even in that, there was that exploitation in there. There was, of course, also slavery. I mean, we don't think of that too often. When we think of slavery in America, we think of African American people, African slaves. But here in Alaska, there was a significant amount of slavery as well. And native people were taken by Russian traders and taken back to Russia. And so that was a significant part. But a lot of people also don't know that native tribes also practiced slavery amongst other native tribes. And so slavery was a unfortunately somewhat common thing in Alaska in the 1700s. And so we do have to wrestle with that, because obviously that causes all sorts of trauma and problems as well. And there's still some memory of that, especially intertribal relationships within Alaska. And I mean, you'll hear about it every now and then, especially like if coastal people or interior people, sometimes there's some bad blood there. But
yeah, I still hear occasionally from
exploration.
I still hear occasionally from some of my native friends some of those old rivalries. They're almost superficial now, but they're still a bit there. Those historical woes. It's interesting to hear them talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. They recognize there's something there, even if they don't really know what it is. And yeah, how much do we have of that too, and how much does that play into things like racism, and I mean just within ourselves? And
yeah, that's a good point.
Anyways, yeah, you could certainly see that right now with Israel and Palestine and people's backgrounds coming out in that, how they feel. But anyways, we're not talking about that today. Exploration, exploitation, and evangelization. So you had the explorers, you had those who came to make a profit, and then you really had those who their main motivation was to bring the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so it's easy to mix all three of those together, but I think that is important, especially for those of us who are in the church, to see that there were people who came who had great hearts for sharing the hope of Jesus Christ. And so there was before 1793, there was a number of different priests and chaplains and whatnot that came along in boats. But in 1793, the Empress Catherine directed the Orthodox Church to recruit missionaries specifically to go to Alaska. So that was the government's first official blessing of the church efforts to go to Alaska. And so there were 8 monks that responded to the call to go to Alaska. And I won't go through all of them, but certainly the most famous of them was somebody who came known as Father Herman. And so the monk Herman, he came along with 7 other priests, and they left Russia they left Russia on Christmas. We're coming up on Christmas soon. December 25th, they left their home. They left all of their family on Christmas of 1793. They got on boats to go across the Bering Straits and go find where God would have them share the gospel in Alaska. And yeah, I mean, just even the date of leaving on Christmas Day, and the idea that these people were coming to make a profit, were coming to try to push some ulterior motive. Just even in their willingness to leave on a Christmas Day, just even shows the amount of sacrifice that they were willing to make. And so these are not people that are coming to destroy native culture, that are coming to make a profit. These are people who are wanting to give up everything. In fact, so all 8 of these had the idea that they were one-way missionaries, and I think that's often a good tell of like what's the motivation of a missionary. If they're coming as a one-way missionary, where I don't know for sure if any of these monks brought their own coffins, but there are a lot of stories even in Alaska of people that would bring their own coffin with them to their place of mission, because knowing that they were going to a place where they could die, and they didn't know if anybody else would make their own coffin, they literally would ship all of their belongings inside a coffin, knowing that this could very well be a one-way ticket. And so I love that about Father Herman in particular. He was a one-way missionary. And
where did he serve in Alaska? Where did Father Herman serve?
Yep. So Father Herman and these 8 monks all ended up on the Kodiak Island.
Oh,
And so just yep, the big island south of Kenai, that's where they
yep.
ended up, and they were funded by the Empress Catherine, so by the Russian government. But they were certainly not they were not rich by any means. Not to mention they didn't really have any money. Didn't even really matter because what are they going to spend money on? But um,
Actually, if I can comment, it just reminds me of, Jesus's disciples themselves. Because, if Jesus did not really raise from the dead, then they wouldn't have made up that story because they lost everything for this, which is
yeah,
a tell
exactly.
of sincerity, which, for Father Herman, we have the similar tell of sincerity by, proverbially packing his coffin with him, like you said. That, man, what a great illustration. That's a cool story.
Yeah, praise the Lord. And so I personally think that Father Herman probably shared the gospel with thousands of Native people, and that was the beginning of the real organized Christian church within Alaska. And
Hmm.
so they showed up in 1794. Of course, remember they left December 25th, 1793. So took them a
Oh, you
little
know what?
bit
I
to get
just did
there.
the
So they showed up
math.
in
I just did the math on that. It's 230 years ago this Christmas, which is kind of cool.
wow, that is amazing. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right
isn't
because
it?
we're 3 year. Yeah, praise the Lord. So they showed up in Russia. I mean, sorry, they showed up in Kodiak from Russia, and they immediately started working. And as was very common amongst all denominational groups, whether it be Russian Orthodox, Evangelical Covenant, whatever, Moravian, Congregationalist, almost always they started ministries of compassion. And so one of the first things they would do is care for orphans. And it's almost like that's how God has designed us. It's all throughout the Old Testament, New Testament, supposed to care for those who are in need. So they built orphanages, they started up schools, and most good denominations, anyway, started learning the language. And so it took them a while. It wasn't until 1807 that one of the fathers had finished the full alphabet in the Alutiiq language, and they began translating. But that's uh, especially going into some of these villages where there was no contact at all. It's not like you're going to go in and speak Russian to them. No, you have to go and learn the language. And so, especially the Russian folks who went out first, the first Russian monks, they had to learn the native languages. So they weren't going in there forcing others to learn their own language. They had to learn the native languages. And so the Russian Orthodox Church,
I just,
they,
if I can
yeah, go
interrupt
for
and
it.
a comment on that is the language thing. It's something close to my heart just because when I lived in Mexico, I learned to speak a tribal language. And the folks there, the indigenous people, some of them spoke Spanish, and so a lot of the missionaries didn't want to take the time to learn their language. But the reality was their heart language was the indigenous language, and Spanish for some of them was a second language. But by doing the work of learning the language, you just feel really dumb for a long time because you're bumbling and they kind of giggle at you when you mess up. But it puts you in a position where they see what you're doing, and over time they accept you as one of their own. Like one of the best compliments I got was one of the indigenous peoples. The people were the Tarahumara people in northern Mexico. And a man came to me once and he said, "You are Tarahumara." And I said, "I am?" And I said, "Why do you think I'm Tarahumara?" And he said, "Because you speak my language." And so it's learning their heart language, which is what the Russian Orthodox did. The value of that, really, it's an invitation to become part of their community. You've put in the work, and they recognize it. And it's their heart language. If you're going to share something as personal and deep, something that affects your heart so deeply, it should be done in your heart language. So I just wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, amen to that. I fully agree with that. And Yeah, praise the Lord. And it is really interesting because it really was the churches that kept the native languages alive,
Mm.
especially in Alaska. And yes, did the American government try to come in and Americanize and kill the native languages? They did. And with the boarding schools later on, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that was a real tactic that the government had, is they punished anybody who was speaking their native language. And what kept it alive in a lot of cases was the church. The church kept native languages alive. So that's something that you don't hear very often. Mostly you hear the church came in and they stole our native language. No, I don't think you know history very well. It was almost entirely churches who recorded the languages and wrote down the orthographies and got all of this. Well, you're a linguist, or have been a linguist anyway, even if you say that you're not. But it is the churches that did that hard work. It just doesn't happen. It takes a lot of hard work.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because pretty much all I have heard speaking with various people on this topic, that's the first thing they point out. They stole the culture. The church stole the culture. The church stole the language. So having that more complete view of the history is really helpful.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that the church is perfect in this either. There are some churches, and we'll get to those, fortunately not today, but there are some churches who did outlaw the use of the native languages, but that is an exception rather than the rule. The rule is definitely that the churches try to record and preserve and encourage native language use. So Russian Orthodox certainly was the first on the scene, and they have kept that going. You go into a Russian Orthodox village today, and usually the Russian Orthodox villages are very, very Yupik speaking down here in the YK Delta. And a big part of that is because the church has encouraged that. And so you can see that in the Russian Orthodox history. And part of that you can see in how they very early on tried to encourage native priests. And so as early as 1810, there's recordings of native priests who were helping in the translation process. 1829, there was another native priest, Jacob Nestiftov. I don't speak Russian, so I apologize to anybody who does, who hears that butchering. But he translated it into another native dialect from that he wasn't a part of, and so he did that linguist work from one tribe to another. And so lots of examples of that cross denominations, but Orthodox were the first ones to really do it, because of course they were the first ones on the scene. But really, Father Herman, he oversaw all of this. He was the first missionary to live in Alaska amongst his other 7 friends. These 8 monks came in 1794, and so he lived the rest of his days, and he really became the bishop, even though he wasn't necessarily recognized as that, but he was basically the bishop of the Alaska mission up until his death of 1837. And so that's a long time. So that's definitely, I think, a big part of why Russian Orthodoxy took hold of Alaska, is because there was consistency. And then right after Father Herman, then Father Veniaminov, who later became known as Bishop Innocent, he was overseeing the Alaska mission for many, many years as well. So there's basically 2 people who led the Alaska mission, oversaw the Alaska mission for the Russian Orthodox Church for almost the first 100 years. And so that created a lot of consistency. And it wasn't until after Bishop Innocent finished ministry in Alaska that things kind of, then also with Protestant churches coming into sale of Alaska to America, we see kind of the Russian Orthodox Church plateau. And but before that, I mean, it seemed like they were really growing and doing a lot of stuff. And oftentimes they were at direct opposition with those who were exploiting Alaska's resources. In fact, Father Herman, he would report that he he survived, he says, multiple assassination attempts by the Russian American company.
Wow.
And the Russian American company, yeah, it's wild. The Russian American company made it against the law for these 8 priests to hold church on Sunday, and they were literally persecuting the Russian Orthodox priests, and so there's clearly different motivations going on between these two groups: those who are exploiting and those who came to evangelize.
More evidence of their sincere motive.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, yeah. Why would you want to come and stay when you're facing assassination attempts by your own people? And clearly they had a calling. And
yeah.
So,
okay. Could you briefly describe what is the state of right now of the Russian Orthodox Church in Alaska? What does that look like now?
Yeah. So the Russian Orthodox Church, especially in the YK Delta region, is, I'd say, very strong. I would consider it very strong. They might not necessarily consider that based off of how it used to be. But when we look at the landscape of different denominations in Western Alaska, there's no real strong church, to be honest. We're all struggling.
Yeah.
Evangelical Covenant Church included. We're all struggling. But I would say there's a real strong Russian Orthodox identity. And one of the things that the Russian Orthodox do really, really well is having native priests. And so I think you can trace back all the way back to Father Herman and his model of ministry. But there has always been a lot of native priests, and it's almost entirely native priests throughout Alaska, which is pretty amazing. Yeah, I mean, obviously, theologically, we're Protestant, and so we have some real theological differences with the Russian Orthodox Church. And I think that there is also a little bit of hesitancy right now because of the Russian-Ukrainian war and kind of the ties to the church there. And I hear people talk about it occasionally out here. But in general, I'd say the Russian Orthodox Church is well accepted amongst the Russian Orthodox villages anyway. And there's still very much a sense of cultural Christianity out here. And so there's some good things to that and some bad things to that, of course. So unfortunately, I think that there's a lot of people who would call themselves Russian Orthodox who don't actually have a relationship with Jesus. And so that's a real challenge. I've also met a number of Russian Orthodox people that I think are totally in love with Jesus, and I look forward to partying with them in heaven someday. And but I would say they are, as far as their system goes in their church, they're probably healthier than most of us.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's a really good summary. So before we move on to the Catholic Church, was there any other aspects of the Russian Orthodox you wanted to point out?
I don't think so. I think we could talk about this for a long time. And I do a 2-hour class on this one. And so I think that's a pretty good overview.
Well, and that's good. Before we go on then, is there any way to make that class available that's without having to go to Alaska Christian College?
Not really at this time. I did actually record my my classes this past year, so I do have some on my hard drive, but they're not available anywhere.
Okay. So for now, it'll be this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say if anybody listening really, really wants to have more, feel free to contact me. They can contact you, and you can send them to me, whatever. But there are also a lot of really good resources. I mean, the Russian Orthodox Church is the Russian Orthodox and the Catholic have the best historical records. And so there's lots of different stuff out there. There's, in fact, other podcasts that I've listened to on Russian Orthodox history. And certainly you'll get a different bent if you listen to somebody who is Russian Orthodox. And so, you can find some stuff out there, and I'd be happy to point anybody towards those resources if they'd like.
Okay, that's really helpful. All right, so let's. I know we don't want the podcast to get too long, but let's take the time to talk about the Catholic Church? What's the history of the Catholic Church in Alaska?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I think it doesn't take as long to talk about the Catholic Church. The Russian Orthodox is more complex because of the government and the private organizations and the church, whereas the Catholic Church is basically entirely church. There's no real government or private sector of the Catholic Church that has really played a big part in Alaska. So we can really just focus on what the church has done. And honestly, I'd say the Catholic Church has the worst reputation amongst just regular people in Alaska, I would say. And so when you talk to people and they say, "Oh, the church has stolen language, the church has stolen traditions and culture," most often they're pointing to things that have happened in the Catholic Church, unfortunately. And so they have the worst reputation, I would say. And some of that is deserved. However, the Catholic Church is huge. And I think people sometimes forget that. But the Catholic Church is huge. And so while, yes, certainly there have been tons of, say, sex abuse scandals. I mean, all you have to do is do a quick Google search and you can find thousands and thousands of sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church worldwide. But part of that is because they are such a big, big church. And so even within Alaska, it's a very big church. There's a lot of villages within the diocese. And certainly one sex abuse scandal is too many. Don't get me wrong. One is too many. But just keep in mind that this is a very big church and lots of things have happened. But there have been a lot of sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church in Alaska. And
if you listen to,
they did kind of a.
Sorry to interrupt. If you listen to an episode called Roger Huntington's Story, he was a victim of that, and so he talks about that in that episode. So you can refer to that one. Sorry, go ahead.
Wow. Yeah, love Roger Huntington. Unfortunately, there's a lot of those stories like Roger's. And in fact, in 2010, you can actually go to the Catholic Church webpage. If you go to the Fairbanks Diocese webpage, you can find it. It's not on the front page, but you can search through and find that there's this reconciliation plan and letter and also recognition of 28 perpetrators. 28 perpetrators in the Catholic Church in Alaska, and 345 confirmed cases of molestation, and how the church apologized for that, and they awarded $9.8 million to 300 victims, which is wild. And so, that's terrible. That's absolutely super terrible. Caused intense trauma, terrible, terrible things. And yet the Catholic Church is acknowledging it. And so that makes that at least says something. And they're not trying to just hide it like they once did. And so they're trying to make it right. There's a lot of stuff that still needs to be done to make it fully right. But that's often what people think about with the Catholic Church is some of those sex abuse scandals.
Well, certainly the board. Certainly the acknowledgement of it is commendable. And I mean, I know of Protestant organizations that have been caught red-handed, so to speak, and their strategy was cover it up. And it's just awful. I mean, the worst imaginable response. So you got to commend the Catholic Church for doing what they did in response.
Yeah, and I hope that they're making changes so that this doesn't happen again.
Right.
But yeah. So people think about that. People think about the boarding schools. And so the boarding schools throughout Alaska, there are very different types of boarding schools. There was the Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding schools, or the Catholic boarding schools. There were other smaller boarding schools like Victory High School, Covenant High School, ones that had really, really positive responses, and that everybody really loves. Great reports from Native people who went to those. But then you also had the BIA school. Sorry, I lumped those all together, but I meant just the last two. Victory High School, Covenant High School, that people really loved. But certainly like the BIA schools, terrible. A lot of Catholic schools, really terrible things happened there. And so when we think of the boarding schools, people often say that was the church's fault, but it wasn't all the church's fault. It was mainly actually the government, but there were also some bad church ones as well. Specifically, the Catholic boarding schools did terrible things, and even the Catholic Church acknowledges that as well. They wouldn't necessarily lead off with this information as I am, but they acknowledge it. I mean, so there is the reason that the Catholic Church has such a bad reputation is because of some of these things, and also bringing in alcohol. Also, something that you don't hear too often, but bingo. Bingo is often a part of Catholic churches, and in Western Alaska, bingo doesn't seem like it might be something that's super destructive, but it is in Western Alaska.
Really?
And there's a there's
is
a
it
lot
because
of
it's tied
parents.
to gambling, or what is the bingo?
Yes, yes, because
okay.
Yep, it's not necessarily even having to do with money at all. And as we know, anytime you gamble, you're really going to lose. You don't gamble to make money unless anyways, regardless. But really, it's more about family breakdown, because there's a lot of single parents who will go to bingo every single night and neglect their children. And I'd say that's really the biggest problem. And it's an addiction. So it becomes an addiction that people are feeding, and they're neglecting their children and just causing the further breakdown of the family and of society. Wow. And so there are a lot of people who really hate the bingo in Catholic churches. So I'd say those are kind of the three kind of really negative things that the Catholic Church has going for them. But it's not all negative, just with any church. It's not all negative. And the Catholic Church has done a lot of really good things in Alaska. And it's really worth noting that the Catholic Church did not initially come into Alaska to try to Americanize. And that's another thing that you hear a lot, is that the church tried to Americanize, to colonize. And that's simply not true. There's almost no churches, with the exception of maybe 2 churches, that came in with the idea that they were going to Americanize. And even the Catholic Church, who became complicit with the boarding school system and that kill the Indian, save the man kind of idea, they didn't come in with that idea. In fact, they came into Alaska in 1779, so they were one of the first on the scene, the first non-Orthodox anyway. So they came first with a Spanish exploration trip in 1779, and they landed in Wales and performed some baptisms there. And so these were Spanish people; they were not American people. 1862, Canadian Catholics came over across the border and shared and tried to do some ministry, and they weren't very successful. But it's really interesting. The people who came, there was the 3 main people were Bishop Clut, Father Lacroix, and an Indian interpreter named Silvar. And so it wasn't just all these white people that came; it was also a native person that came as well, and came to share the gospel. And so they kind of they planted the seed for the mission in Fort Yukon. And so first people I came across, not American at all. And it wasn't until 1873 that the Catholic Church officially started a station in St. Michael. So here we go. Here's something interesting. So it wasn't actually until 1902 that the first American Roman Catholics were sent to Alaska.
Wow.
So it was the first. So the Catholic Church had been in Alaska for some 25 years, 30 years, established without having any American presence, as it were. And so the idea that they came to Americanize just really is false. That was not their primary motivation for coming into Alaska. Now, did it become that with the boarding schools? I would say yes, amongst at least those that were tied to the boarding schools, but it was not their original intent. By the time you got to the boarding school era, the damage to culture was already pretty evident. And so anyways, moving on. So the Catholic Church came in. It was not coming from America initially, and they were focusing on the Fort Yukon area initially, but didn't have a whole lot of success. And their first real success came in the Southeast in 1878. Father Althoff went to reside in Wrangell, and that became the main focus of their church down there. In 1888, I hear some planes out there. This will be interesting for you.
It is Alaska.
I'm gonna skip around here in the timeline, but just because I heard that engine there, it's very interesting that you're over there, Kingdom Air Corps, and there's lots of airplane ministries out here. The Catholic Church is probably the first church that tried to have an airplane ministry.
Wow.
And so 1930,
Wow.
$750,000 was raised to buy an airplane. 1930. That's a long time ago. There's not a lot.
That's
of people
a lot of
that
money for
airplanes.
1930, and that's only aviation's only 2-3 decades old at that time.
Exactly. So they raised a boatload of money, super lots of money, and they got probably, I would guess, the very first mission plane in Alaska. And unfortunately, it crashed on its very first flight. Super sad. So that was the beginning of mission aviation in Alaska. It didn't start out well. Fortunately, it's gotten a lot better since then. Praise the Lord.
Yeah, we hope so.
Oh yes, I have been the beneficiary of a lot of really good mission pilots, and I am very thankful for them.
Good.
But so the Catholic Church got in on stuff like that. They got in on schools and orphanages, hospitals, just like most of the other church denominations did as well. Also, one thing that makes the Catholic Church really unique is nuns and the sisters. And so you can see the evidence of the sisters' work all throughout Alaska. And you can go into Providence. Providence is started by the Sisters of Providence, the Catholic nuns. And so there used to be Providence hospitals throughout the state, not just there in Anchorage. And there are still others around the state too, but we think mostly of Anchorage when we think of Providence. But Catholics had churches, and Catholics had hospitals in Nome and Fairbanks, etc. And so that's a big part of what the nuns did. And nuns are a mixed bag. They're a mixed bag as far as church history goes. Some of them were awesome, did amazing things. Sisters of Providence, I think, were really good ones. There were also some that were very bad. And I would say there was a group of nuns that went to Holy Cross that were probably the first female missionaries in Alaska. But they refused to learn the language. They banned native dance. And so that's definitely something that you'll hear, especially Native people talk about how the church banned native dance. And that's not 100% true. Even within the Catholic Church, it was a mixed bag. Some encouraged it, some just left it alone, and there were some that banned it as well. And throughout the different denominations, there are some that banned it, some that left it alone, and some that encouraged it. We'll talk about the Salvation Army later, which is a church group, and they encourage it. In fact, they had native dance at their very first dedication to their first church building. So it's not true that the church came in and destroyed native dance. That those are cases that it did happen, but there's cases that it didn't happen. You can't say as a blanket general statement that that's what the church did. But there are cases of the nuns in Holy Cross that didn't allow native dance. And so, so there is some truth to that. Like a lot of churches, Western Alaska ministry really took off during the gold rush. You'll see that throughout a lot of the different churches. 1898 to 1905 ish there was a big boom of churches because there was a big boom of people. And especially in the Nome area, there's a lot of churches that claim Nome as kind of like their hub, and it's all because of the gold rush. And there's real interesting things about that. We'll probably talk more about that more in the
Yeah, I'm very interested in the
church
history
days.
of the gold rush. I've done a little bit of reading, and yeah, I'd like to dive into that more in the future. That's a very interesting time.
Yeah, interesting. Not all good, mostly bad, actually, but there's some good there too. And so the gold rush is actually when the first. Yes, a lot of mistakes to learn from, but not all bad. I'll just give you a sneak preview of the Covenant Church. So the Covenant missionary during the gold rush refused to go to the gold mines, and he hosted, though, people who would go, they were on their way to Nome to go strike it rich. And he would tell all of them, remember the church when you strike it rich and tithe. And not all of them did, but enough of them did that it funded years of ministry for the Covenant Church, the gold miners' tithes. So anyways,
interesting.
Not all bad. But we're talking about the Catholic Church now. Yep. So the Catholic Church, they're a big organization. They spread out pretty quickly. But it wasn't all just missionaries going and making their own decisions to go places, kind of like with Maniluk that we talked about early in the episode. Maniluk, he prepared the way. In a lot of ways, he was like the John the Baptist of the native people, because he was preparing the way, telling them, get ready for these people who are going to come and share about this Father and Son Spirit. And so likewise, even in the Catholic Church, there's a story of how in 1904, the whole village of King Island converted because the chief's daughter had a prophecy that there was people who were going to come and tell them about the Creator God. And so I can't actually remember if this was a case of the native people seeking out missionaries or the missionaries just happened to come shortly after. Certainly there are plenty of stories of native people who sought out a missionary and asked them to come to their village. But in this case, because this daughter of a chief in King Island had a dream, had a prophecy, and told the villagers about these missionaries who were going to come and tell them about the Creator God, the entire village converted in 1904. And most often we think about these stories and we hear these stories in Protestant circles, but this happened in the Catholic Church. And so I think God was on the move working there. And there's lots of stories we could talk about in the Catholic Church. But I'd say one of the things that the Catholic Church did well as the Orthodox Church did is they got the language into written form. And so this was before the BIA days, but it was very, very common. Can you explain what BIA
is? You've mentioned it a lot.
So the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs is a government agency. It still exists, and it really was created down in the lower 48 to manage all of the tribes on reservations. And so it wasn't created really with Alaska in mind. And so they in general have not done a very good job historically of caring for Native people in Alaska. But nevertheless, the BIA schools, though, were the worst case of what the BIA has ever done. They do some good things, especially now too, but they have caused a lot of harm as well. But they are a government agency not tied to the church at all.
Yeah. Okay. That's really helpful. Thank you.
We'll talk about that another day.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, but I think we can probably kind of land the plane a little bit. There's a lot of priests. Father Thomas Cunningham was one of them in Nome, Old St. Joe's, and he spent 4 hours a day in the midst of his ministry, 4 hours a day learning Inupiaq so that he become fluent, and lots of stories of that. One thing that the Catholic Church has done very poorly at is encouraging native priests So there are very, very few instances of any native priests. And so that's, I don't really know all of the reasons for that. You'd have to talk to a Catholic person. But yeah, that is just a very interesting kind of side note. The first native priest that I could find record of was in 1958. And there's just very, very few of those. And so, yeah, it's just kind of a interesting, strange thing.
Yeah. So maybe a couple of takeaways from both of these churches. We'll kind of land the plane now, as you say. That's a great euphemism. I like that. Couple of takeaways, like, for example, from the Russian Orthodox Church, some things that they did really well. I want to just review some of those just for our own learning value. It sounds like that they, for one thing, they learned the language. They did translation. They kind of honored the people, and they also empowered the people. Like, they were the first ones to have some native priests, if you will, and actual leaders in the church. So they did that well. Are there any other things that maybe the Russian Orthodox did well, and then we'll just review those, and then the Catholics?
I'd say one-way missionaries. I mean, people who were sold out. This is my whole life. I mean, say that was a really good example, and I'd say that's probably something that they still have to this day. That those who are priests, they're all in. They're in this for life, and they're not. This is not just something that they're dabbling in. Yeah, and then you said also about the Catholics.
Yeah.
And I'd say one of the things that the Catholics did really well is hospitals, caring for the sick, caring for the orphans, and and I'd say in some ways, certainly with the example of King Island, that they went to places where they were welcomed. And that was not always the case, but certainly some of the times they were ready to go. And I'd say that was a benefit of the Catholic Church, because they're such a big organization. If they were invited to a place, they were ready to go. And that's not always the case in most, especially Protestant groups. And the Protestant groups, they really struggled with having enough people to go to the places that were needed. And there's far more instances of Native people asking, almost begging for missionaries to be sent to their village, that there just wasn't somebody to send. And,
wow.
I mean, we still see that today.
So it's like the Catholic Church had the people and resources available. When it's like the opportunity arose, they were just on it, and they did that really well.
Yeah. And it seems like they didn't hesitate.
Yeah. Okay. That is so helpful, Adam. I'm really thankful that you spent this time. This has been enriching for me. I feel like I have a more complete view. And of course, we're going to do at least 4 more episodes with the rest of the Christian denominations in Alaska and their history. And I'm really looking forward to the next 4 episodes. So thank you so much for just sharing your class that you normally teach and people pay for. Here it is for free.
Hey, well, a short version anyway.
The abbreviated version.
The opportunity, Billy.
Okay,
that's right.
Well, yeah. Until next time, we thank you guys for tuning in. And this is Adam London, pastor at Bethel Evangelical Covenant Church in Bethel, Alaska. And so we'll see you next time, Adam.
All right, God bless.